Good evening. My name is Malcolm Young. I'm the Dean of Grace Cathedral, and welcome to the forum, and thanks for joining us online. Every year, Grace Cathedral chooses a theme for reflection, and in 2021, our theme is the Year of Healing. As we enter the second year of the pandemic, we know that we need more than healing. We need strength, endurance, and perhaps even more importantly, we need hope. In March of 2019, Larry Brilliant was my guest at the forum. He is a brilliant physician and epidemiologist. He's a key member of the successful efforts by the World Health Organization to eradicate smallpox in Southeast Asia in the 1970s. And I remember at that forum 2 years ago, we talked about what we could learn from the history of smallpox as we faced hypothetical pandemics of the future. And then, just 1 year later, COVID-19 entered our lives. Tonight, we welcome back the most perfect guest that we can have in the Year of Healing, and he'll help us to put the pandemic in perspective and to help us to understand what's really happening now and what we can expect next. Larry, it's so good to see you tonight. Thanks so much for joining us. We're so glad that you could make it.
It's so good to see you, Malcolm. You forgot my major accolade, which I consider myself a friend of Grace Cathedral and a friend of Malcolm's.
Indeed. I actually, when they prepared all the kind of the promotional material, the communications material for it, like I had to stop myself because there's so much that I love about you that's so much more important than, those honors that you've received in so many different ways. And I just felt like they're just playing it too safe and not showing the just full breadth of your personality.
You didn't start off with the monastery in the Himalayas?
Yeah, that's what I wanted to. I wanted to have the monastery in there. I wanted to have the rock and roll in there. I was like, there's not enough rock and roll in this picture.
He's a San Francisco doctor,
It's so good to have you, though. It's so good to see you, definitely. I was just saying, a few people talked to me about tonight and were telling me about how excited they are to tune in tonight. And I kept telling them almost every week of the pandemic, I've had these huge questions for you. And I read the San Francisco Chronicle articles, saw you in the press a zillion different times, but each week I just had a different question. And it was constantly changing. I didn't really understand what was happening, and I knew that you were the person with the answers, and I knew that we'd have this chance tonight to talk too. But I want you to talk a little bit just about like that experience with smallpox and just that work to try to eradicate that disease. And what we can learn from that in terms of what we're doing now.
Well, first of all, my wife, Girja, is also on. She's the beautiful woman in the shadow of that rainbow circle, that Buddhist Enzo that's over there. And she and I lived in India for about 10 years. We started off living in an ashram, a monastery in the Himalayas. And then we both went to work for the World Health Organization to help eradicate smallpox. And when I was hired as literally the junior most person, not just on the team, but I think in the history of WHO. And while I was a physician, I'd sort of forgotten about it because I've been reading the New Testament, the Old Testament, the Bhagavad Gita, the Quran, Talmud, everything that in this monastery. And I showed up with hair down to the middle of my back and a big Old Testament looking beard and wearing white pajamas that they may have thought I'd just gotten out of either a lunatic asylum or prison someplace. And they did hire me as the mascot on the team. They literally had to create a position low enough that they could hire me. And so I got to sit at the feet of the world's best epidemiologists. And learn about the history of smallpox, to know that it was a biblical disease, that there was then an unbroken chain of transmission going back to Pharaoh Ramses V.
Wow.
And I got to stay as we had hundreds of thousands of people making 2 billion house calls to every corner of India, Bangladesh, Nepal, which is where the last cases of smallpox in the world were. And then I got to visit the last case of variola major in the wild on Earth, a little girl named Rahima Banu on the island of Bola in Bangladesh. And when her scabs fell off and she stopped coughing and there was no more virus in her body and all the virus had fallen on the ground and been cooked by the sun and had died. That was the end of that unbroken chain of transmission that had lasted thousands and thousands of years. That virus was gone. And you can feel it, I think, even now as I talk about it. I could certainly feel it then, the gratitude that I had to the good Lord for taking that one form of suffering off of our back. And if you see something like that, and I probably was in villages where thousands of little babies died of smallpox, where hundreds of cremation fires of people who had spots all over their body, rivers in some places that didn't run because of how many dead bodies there were. If you go from, being just a kid, the mascot, ball boy, and I wound up running that India program in India, and I saw the last case of smallpox. How can you not ever feel a sense of awe, gratitude, and a spiritual awakening that how could you ever not feel optimistic and
I love that because I think that sometimes people think that there's an antagonistic relation between religion and science, and I just don't believe that at all. It's like different ages. I mean, I was reading an article this week about Jonathan Edwards died as a result of his inoculation, the most famous theologian in North America, but it was because. Yeah, I mean, he didn't die because of this, but those Puritan ministers that we have such a hard time identifying with were really the intellectual giants of their society, and they were the ones who really pushed for having everybody be inoculated. They were the most scientific members of their world, and they had that appreciation that you had mentioned of just the beauty and the intricacy and the extraordinary uniqueness of all that we experience. It's a really deep part of my piety. What the physicists and the astrophysicists are discovering is just it's hugely important for my spirituality. But I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that. It's just the relation between religion and spirituality for you.
I tweeted yesterday the story of the first vaccine trial in the United States in 1805 in Milton, Massachusetts. A friend of mine, Steve Jones, had sent me this article. So I decided to tweet it because it was 12 children who had been vaccinated, who were then injected with live smallpox to see if the vaccine actually worked. Yeah. And they were held in a room for 14 days until the incubation period of smallpox they thought would have passed. And when they opened the door and they were all alive and well, then all the people gave praise to God. And this guy who wrote up this first vaccine trial wrote a card, and at the top of the card he said he has died on the cross, and he wrote about what his experience was watching that gift. Now that's not to say there aren't other theologians who are and were on the other side of that.
I agree.
In that moment, it was really something, and for me, my guru told me that was my spiritual path, was to work to alleviate suffering. And he gave it a name, this yoga that he taught me, Nishkam Karma Yoga. You and I've talked about this in the past, but it's like saying, as Gandhi said, Kam bhi pujahe, work is also a form of worship, a form of yoga. And for me, I worked on smallpox and polio and blindness and now pandemics. I'm still carrying out my teacher's instructions.
Yeah, that's what I love. I love the word I use for it is ministry. Diakonia is the Greek word for it. It's related to the word for deacon. Yeah, you're at the front line. That's what I love so much. It's just the pattern of your life. It's evolved to different projects, and yet there's that thread that connects them all, which is that sense of ministry and basically love of other people. I wonder if you can talk just a little bit about the virus, like what is a virus? And then maybe you can talk a little bit about just like this project of making the vaccines. Because I just remember a year ago, just having people say, don't be too optimistic about the vaccine coming. It may take a while to make this. Maybe you can talk about that whole process. So what is a virus? And then how do vaccines get made?
Well, it's almost a theological argument. Is a virus a living thing or
Right,
not?
right. I read that article in the New York Times.
What is a living thing? It's growth, reproduction, irritability, movement, metabolism, nutrition. That's what we're taught in medical school. And this virus doesn't have all those characteristics, so it's considered to not be living, but it does reproduce. In fact, if you think of it, it's a bunch of RNA, which is a computer code, and it's surrounded by a sack of fatty, oily lipids. That's all it is. It has no intentionality. It's not trying to kill us. It is programmed to do one thing, and that is to replicate and to survive. And because of that, one virus, one person who's sick, gives rise to three others. At the beginning of this outbreak, that was called the reproductive number.
Right.
And then that becomes an exponent, and you have exponential growth. So one case goes to 3, goes to 9, goes to 27. And that's how we've gotten to over 100 million. And it's the viruses constantly replicating. And the reason we're at so many different, earlier you and I spoke about it, we're not just at one crossroad right now, which we usually are with this pandemic. We're at a dozen different crossroads right now. And one of the biggest crossroads is, what about the variants?
Yes.
And who will win the race between the novel variants and the new vaccines? And we can take that all apart later, but the nature of that race and why it's important to everybody is because you want to know that the vaccine you're getting is durable. And I want to say today's vaccine, clobber today's variants. Tomorrow's variants are going to start off with a lead in the race. We're spotting them a head start. And why are there variants? Because if we have had 100 million people, actually 120 some odd million people, who are known to have been sick from this virus, and we know that there's 3 or 4 asymptomatics that we didn't catch for every one that we've got, you've got several 100 million people, each of them had tens of billions of viruses in their body. Every one of those viruses has one prime directive: replicate, replicate, replicate. And when it replicates, because it's a single strand of RNA, DNA is a double strand. When DNA replicates, one of the strands serves as a spell checker or an editor. Single strand of DNA makes a lot of mistakes. These are called mutations. So you've got billions of viruses in every person, hundreds of millions of people. Multiply those, you have a big number of mutations that are possible. And from that, most of the mutations are harmless or evolutionary dead ends for the virus. But every once in a while, that roulette wheel comes up unfavorable to human beings. And the virus becomes a VOC, a variant of concern. And that invariably is because the new variant, still the COVID disease, still the SARS-CoV-2 virus, but that new one is more transmissible. It affects people faster and faster. And that's what we're facing right now is, whether you call it the UK variant, the California variant, South African variant, Brazilian variant, there will undoubtedly be many, many more. Today's vaccines cover all of them. Today's therapeutics, the monoclonal antibodies that are put together in a cocktail, they clobber all of the known variants. But tomorrow, there will be new variants, and they will outfox, outrun, outrace the vaccines. And all the vaccine manufacturers are today working on their next booster shot.
Right.
So this summer, I expect Pfizer and Moderna to have their booster shots getting ready.
Oh, I'm so glad you told me that. Yeah.
And those booster shots will cover those variants, but it will be a race like this. I don't know if you can see my hands, but
Yeah.
today's vaccine, tomorrow's variants, that booster, and we will always be a step behind, but we will always, so far, we've been able to create the countermeasures that work. And
I love the image that you give us because, I have felt like there are different at each stage there. We've been through these very discrete stages, and you're right. We're at these kind of crossroads. And I like the idea of just like a multi-dimensional crossroads, because there's that element. And then there's also the element of, will people get the vaccines? And I wonder if you can, will they get vaccinated? And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that, because, at the early stages of the vaccination process, we may not be paying very much attention to it, but as it's really available to everyone, then whether people get the vaccine or not will become much more part of our consciousness. So what is current thinking in terms of just whether people will actually get vaccinated?
Oh, I think that increasingly more people will get vaccinated, and the anti-vaxxers, or the people who want to wait and see with justifiable skepticism. The mRNA vaccine is a scientific marvel, but it's brand new and we don't have a lot of experience with it. But George and I can tell you that we got our second vaccine on Valentine's Day. We've been married 50 years. We thought that'd be
perfect.
And yesterday was the 14th day after that. So we are now immunized. And I'll tell you, the world feels different. I didn't think I'd be that touched by it, but we were really touched by knowing that that we're immunized, and we want everybody else to be immunized. So I will tell you that today, with the vaccine in short supply, much more so in the rest of the world, 100 countries will not get even a quarter of the vaccine they need for the next 5 years. So, we've got right now increasing numbers of people being vaccinated, over 2 million a day. We've purchased enough vaccine to vaccinate every man, woman, and child in the United States 2 or even 2.5 times over, more than we need. Soon we're going to be, I hope, donating our excess to the rest of the world. But there'll be a tipping point somewhere in June, July, where instead of being demand-driven, we will be supply-driven. And that's when we'll see how many people will have taken the vaccine. I wouldn't want people to think that we're going to reach this herd immunity and then there'll be rainbows and unicorns and it's all over and let's go to the beach. It's a slow, gradual process, and we will be dealing with these variants for a while. But once we get a lot of people vaccinated and we get into this cadence, it will be a little bit like the flu vaccine, where every year you'll get your booster, and it won't be this terrifying thing that is always present in the back of our head. Oh, what about COVID?
So I've noticed exactly what you've described, just because I'm always interacting with people of just every different age range. And my friends who are older who've received the vaccine, it's almost like this huge weight is lifted off them. So it's almost like we're all going through some things in the same way, but it feels very different. I think if you're, a 67-year-old person who's had the vaccination and versus like a 37-year-old person or a 17-year-old person, it almost makes those differences in our ages just more pronounced.
Well, I want to make it clear that I didn't cut in line.
No. Exactly.
I'm as old as you think I am.
That's great. That's great. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just kind of, because I remember reading in your book and I remember talking to you. It's so funny because there's so many things you taught me in a very theoretical way that about pandemics and about these terrible diseases. And then, a year after you taught me the last lesson, I all of a sudden I'm learning things for myself. But I wonder, in our conversations, you've always talked about just kind of the role of governments, like how governments can make things better or make things worse. And I wonder if you can just talk about just how that happened in terms of just what you see out in the world, like which national governments did a good job of handling it and which ones didn't, and what was the difference between what the groups that succeeded and the ones that didn't.
Well, first, I would speak to everybody who's watching this. You could be left wing or right wing or Republican or Democrats. Maybe you fell in love with Ayn Rand. I did in high school, but we divorced a couple years later.
I'm glad, because yours is so much cuter.
Silicon Valley. But whatever your feeling is about government, surely, if ever there were any reason for government, a pandemic is a perfect reason. Only government, and in fact, only a series of governments working together at a global level, but hope to mount an effective countermeasure to this. And as you said, or as you implied, Malcolm, there are winners and losers. There are governments that have done a spectacular job, like Vietnam and South Korea and Taiwan and New Zealand and Iceland. And there are governments that have done a terrible job, like shockingly Sweden and Brazil and the UK and the United States. And for us, it's maybe if you're grading on a curve, we would probably get the lowest grade because we have the most resources. We've always led the world in fighting against every other pandemic, and whether it was Zika or Ebola or swine flu, and we were absent from the global world in fighting this disease. And we were pretty much in a state of denial for most of the first year. So the virus is bad enough. We shouldn't be adding self-inflicted wounds. But when I say that other countries have succeeded, even before there was a vaccine, Vietnam, Taiwan, South Korea went hundreds of days without a single case. Um, Taiwan had one case, they declared a national emergency. And in 3 weeks, it was over. No COVID. Adelaide in New Zealand, just the end of last week, had 2 cases. They closed down the city. It'll be open again in a week, and there'll be no cases in New Zealand. We have not, and that's all before the vaccine. It'll be easier when the vaccine can be applied to that problem as well. But that's not what we've done. And now we have a different administration. It has a different ideological belief in the value of government. And you're seeing what's happening. We're increasing the number of vaccines. This $1.9 trillion stimulus package has billions of dollars for contact tracers, for testing, for isolation. If it passes, we will be paying people who otherwise wouldn't be able to isolate themselves because they have to earn a living. They have this Sophie's choice between, am I going to go to work and feed my kids, or am I going to stay home and protect my kids from catching the disease that I might get? So what the government's going to step in and do, it's going to have hotels with those folks who are essential workers, otherwise couldn't isolate themselves, will be able to stay for the 10 or 14-day period that they have to be isolated. And then they'll be vaccinated if they wish. So we're going to have a whole different, things are going to feel different as far as availability of vaccine, conscientiousness of testing, tracing, and isolation. It is a great puzzle to me. It is a disheartening note to history that this has become the symbol of a political party.
Yeah.
But I will tell you one anecdote, because we had the same thing in 1918. There was an anti-mask party in San Francisco.
Right, I remember. I studied it actually. Yeah.
Yeah.
And they had bonfires. They burned all the masks in the bonfires.
Burned all the masks. They accused the people who were getting masks of being heretics.
Yeah, totally.
And then in December of 1918, when by wearing the masks and socially distancing themselves because they didn't have vaccine, they had brought the cases down to just a fraction. They had a big party in Union Square in San Francisco, and they said no more masks were free, and they danced, and of course that gave rise to the biggest part of the epidemic.
Yeah, exactly. I studied it because we wanted to have an Armistice Day service. And I said, well, what did we do for Armistice Day? And the archivist said we didn't have church. And I wasn't aware of any of that had ever happened. Yeah, because in my life, there's never been a day when we didn't have church. But yeah, that's what I learned. I wonder what, through the whole course of this, what surprised you the most just about how this has just unfolded? You were so well equipped to understand what was happening through your earlier experiences, but what were some of the surprises within this last year for you?
Well, I am representative of a group of infectious disease epidemiologists who've been predicting this pandemic for 30 years. My wife says that I have correctly predicted 10 of the last 1 pandemics.
I love that. That's great.
So I was well prepared to predict this. And of course, I worked as the science advisor on contagion, and I've been writing about pandemics for a long time. But so I think I'm just representative of that group. I'm not unique. We are all surprised by 2 things, one about the virus and the other about the government.
Yeah.
Because we did war games, we did tabletop exercises. Even when we were making Contagion, we never envisioned an incompetent government response. We always
Right. Right.
assumed that there would be a competent government. The CDC, which has always been that shining light, would continue to lead us, but it was silenced. So that was a big surprise. And then the pathogenesis of the virus. I know that's a word that's not familiar to many people, but the pathogenesis means the way in which the pathology, the way in which the disease progresses. That has been astonishing. The fact that a respiratory disease, because it's spread respiratory, that it could affect you nose to toes. And when you get COVID, you don't just get a pneumonia. Your liver, your kidney, your spleen, your brain are all filled with COVID, and all the little micro blood vessels get a vasculitis. And as you're seeing now, well over half of the people who got COVID still have some symptoms of it 6 months later. This is not a flu. And so that the extent of it is so different than what we saw with SARS and MERS, sisters or cousins, another coronavirus like COVID. But we only had those two diseases around for a few months before they burned out. And they burned out because they killed 40 or 50 or 60% of the people who got it.
Right.
Note to self, if you incarnate as a virus, do not have a strategy in which you kill all your
Kill
customers.
everybody. Yeah.
Bad strategy.
Yeah, it's funny. We watched Contagion again at the early stage of and it was uncanny watching it just to be in that experience, and then remember that we'd been told about that experience ahead of time. It was really interesting. I wonder if you kind of were the presidential advisor in February, so you'd basically say you should have a national policy of just immediately quarantining everyone. Is that right? What other advice would you give for a national leader at the beginning of something like COVID?
If you look at the other countries that have done well, each has done something different really, really well. Vietnam went 100 days without a single infection because they did contact tracing and they contacted 100% of contacts. We contact trace about 5%. So that's what they did well. Taiwan didn't do that well in contact tracing, but it responded so quickly that anyone who was contacted or had the disease, they were visited by part of the government, the doctor, within 12 hours.
Wow.
Each of these countries that have done well have found a pattern of activities unique for their culture and for them. So there's 100 different ways to succeed, and there's only one way to fail.
Yeah.
And that's by inattention to detail and inattention, underestimating the virus. And that's sort of what I've seen.
Yeah. Disinformation is something that you always talked about too, and it's one thing to think of disinformation in the smallpox epidemic, but I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that and just like the role of the internet in this. What did you see and what did you notice, and is there something that tech companies like Twitter and Facebook and Google can do a little bit better in the future about?
So 5 years ago, the Rockefeller Foundation held a meeting at its retreat in Italy, in Bellagio. And the topic of the retreat is, will there be a pandemic and will there be disinformation in the pandemic?
Yeah.
How prescient they were.
Yeah.
And what we talked about was things like gaming the system, like financial investors shorting the Irish pound and then putting out lies that there was a lot of the pandemic in Ireland. And then when the pound went down in value, buying it back up again. We never dreamed of the kind of studious, careful disinformation campaign that Russia launched. Forget the presidential election.
Right.
About this pandemic. So much of the anti-vax sentiment, so much of the mask fear, so much of the disingenuity is actually Russian bots.
Yeah.
And Rockefeller predicted it, but I don't think any of us really expected it at the level that it is. As far as the tech companies, I sure wouldn't give them an A, but I wouldn't give them as low a grade maybe I would give if we were grading on preservation of democracy. But in the case of the pandemic, they're all trying because their interests where all the interests are aligned. I think some of the things that Facebook and Twitter and Salesforce and Apple have done it really terrific. And even when we're not sure how well they're going to work, they come up with something that could work amazingly. These digital notification systems.
Right.
They're in their infancy. They're a bit elitist now because you have to have a smartphone, but it's just the beginning. I think that there could be something really phenomenal about them as they get better and more sophisticated. And if you've got a phone, you've got a chance to opt into that system. And I urge people to opt into it and use it, because it will tell you if you or your phone have been within proximity of somebody who has been tested positive. You may not have known that. And that's information that you should have.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, there are so many different examples of ingenuity. The cathedral has a school, and to keep that school open and to just figure out all the requirements. I mean, it's a heroic activity. I'm so proud of our students, our teachers, and our administrators. But I wonder if you can talk about other examples of creativity that you've seen that's come out of this terrible time.
So I started this little group called Pan Defense in 2005, but I resurrected it for this pandemic.
Time to bring it back.
It's gone dormant. So we were asked by the Directors Guild and the Producers Guild in Hollywood to figure out whether Hollywood could go back to work. And we designed protocols, which was 2 tests before you come back to work, wear a mask except when you're in front of the camera, and then get tested 3 times a week or every day. They worked. Hollywood sets are the safest place in America to be. We did the same thing for Wavy Gravy's camp.
Oh, great. I'm
Camp
glad.
last summer was safe. There was no transmission of the disease on the set.
Yeah.
And then I did the same thing for the Democratic Convention. And I'm pleased to say that we kept it safe. We offered the technology for the Republicans. Maybe they didn't take it, but we offered it.
Yeah.
So it's a new way of using testing, not to tell you if you have the disease, but to tell you if you will get the disease in 48 hours, if you will become infectious. And that's just one of the things. The other, of course, I have to talk about the vaccines.
Yeah, I definitely want to hear about that.
The mRNA vaccines are just, they're a miracle. We always used to say when I was at Google that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic.
Magic, I agree. I remember that quote. I can't remember who it came from.
I don't remember who said it, but
yeah.
We would quote it all the time whenever we were working on something great. We thought, well, this is indistinguishable from magic. This is not a vaccine like Jenner in 1797 noticing that milkmaids who had cowpox lesions on their fingers from milking a cow were immune.
Right.
That's the origin.
Exactly.
In fact, the word vaccine comes from Bacchus or cow.
Of course, that's great.
Say to somebody, I'm going to give you a vaccination. You're really saying I'm going to give you a cow.
Yes, completely.
But the mRNA science is to take a set of literally computer codes and wrap it in an envelope similar to what the virus is wrapped in, and then inject it so that your body makes antibodies, or actually your body makes a kind of imitation virus, and then it creates antibodies to both the imitation virus and the real virus. And this is astonishingly, I'd be really surprised if it doesn't get the Nobel Prize.
Yeah.
I'd also be astonished if in the end, when we look back and we say, what were the things that saved us from something even worse, that the mRNA vaccines will be close to the top.
Yeah, that's great. I'm so glad you just remind us. It's just, I'm so grateful every day for the folks who worked on that. It was a global project, and just it gives you faith in humanity when human beings can do something like that. And
can I say something else?
Yeah, definitely.
If you look at the big vaccine companies, they're all run by CEOs, and all those CEOs of the first 3 at least, and the 4th coming in, have something in common. They're all immigrants.
That's good to be reminded of too. Exactly. That's great.
But we have,
you're so right. And
Hamilton was right. If you want to get it done, give it to an immigrant to do. I mean, we have so much gratitude for these people who have come from other places to come here and have built these vaccines.
Yeah, exactly. What a good thing to remember when we think about immigration policies. One of the things I think probably everybody's asking you this, and that is like, what's going to happen next? Like, we're at that multidimensional crossroads, and I was at a meeting today, and they were talking about the Jewish high holy days, like Labor Day weekend time frame, and basically saying, we're not going to be able to celebrate those in the way that we usually do because of the pandemic. And I wonder, just kind of like in your crystal ball, what does the future look like to you? Like, when can we go see a movie in a movie theater in San Francisco?
My crystal ball has broken, and my prospective, I guess I didn't plug it in. I think it's reasonable to assume that vaccine supply will begin to exceed demand in the early summer, the June, July timeframe. That will be the time that anybody who wants a vaccine can just go down to their Walgreens or CVS and get it. That will be a big change. And then we look at what happens when there's more supply than demand.
Yeah.
That's in the United States. But for the rest of the world, not so. 100 countries will not be able to get enough vaccine to vaccinate a quarter of their population over the next several years. WHO has put together something called COVAX, which is a funding organization, and they only have been able to raise enough money to provide 2 billion doses of vaccine. The math is pretty clear. There's 7.5 billion of us. A high percentage will require 2 doses.
Yeah.
We don't have enough vaccine. So that means more cases. And it's one of the rare moments when your spiritual life, your ethical training, your scientific training, your sense of justice, and your selfishness are all perfectly aligned. In fact, I can't think of it other time. Because if you don't help the rest of the world vaccinate its own population, then you'll have hundreds of billions more viruses, billions more cases, hundreds of billions of more mutations, replicants, and then variants of concern. And that's the truth is they're all going to come back into the United States.
Yeah.
And we're going to export ours, and there's going to be this kind of ping-ponging back and forth, whack-a-mole between states that have done a good job and countries that have done a good job. But we really need to think about the global mission that we have of working together with countries all over, whatever your politics are. If you still believe that it should be US out of UN, whatever you believe, this is not the time for that. This is the time for all in, working together, helping to find a way to get enough vaccine for everywhere. And also, I would say, helping to create more innovations. We can do some of the things we did in smallpox. We can find every case. We can vaccinate around it. We can do some of the things we did in Ebola. We were very good in stopping Ebola 2 years ago. Let's look at the countries that are good role models. I think I failed to mention that Taiwan and New Zealand and Singapore all have another thing in common. They're all run by women.
Right.
I mean, these are all really interesting nuggets to argue against so many stereotypes. But we need to work together with 200 countries and find a way. This is, if you remember the biblical injunction that the least of you, whoever does kind to the least of you does so for me.
Yeah.
It's never been more true in the secular way than it is right now.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I just remember in the 1990s, I was working for the United Nations for the Millennium Development Goals, and was at a conference at the Vatican in Rome. And it was the first time I realized that global poverty is a choice. We can eradicate poverty. And it's the same thing here. It's just, and it's really about a spiritual reality of the value of every single human life. And my guest next week is Judith Butler, the professor from UC Berkeley, and she writes extensively about this. And she talks about grievability. Like, there are some lives that we don't grieve over, and and this is, like you say, this moment of of when all those things come together. One of the things I wanted to ask you about too, which is just, this was like a huge question I had for the last 3 months, and that is just about just kind of like the ethics of making priorities in terms of how you vaccinate people in a society, right? So how do you decide to like do an age-based criterion or work like what their people's jobs is as the criterion, or like what are kind of the ethical challenges of how you decide to vaccinate people by category versus just randomly, for instance?
Yeah, I have a very different view than most people. I think that the person you should vaccinate first is the person who stands to be the next person to get infected and to infect others.
Mm.
That takes priority over all these other decisions. That being said, there are good and noble reasons for vaccinating communities. The African American community accounted for 80% of the deaths in Georgia for the first 6 months.
Mm.
Nursing home community accounted for 75% of the deaths in the Bay Area for the first 6 months. The Hispanic community has a death rate 3 times higher than the white community. Nursing homes, first responders, doctors and nurses working in hospitals to keep them running, or else you'll add deaths from heart attack and difficult pregnancies to the list of things that are caused by the virus if everybody else in the hospital has COVID. There's good reasons for every one of those choices, but it did get to me, and I hope my friends don't misunderstand. When I read that the Railway Workers Union said either we prioritize vaccinating railway workers or they're going to stop the trains.
Hmm.
And of course, they're as right as anybody else. Don't get me wrong. But when I realized that because of an absence of federal leadership and a plan, we left everybody on their own. So of course, everybody looked to their own interests and their own community and to people who looked like them or who worked like they did. That's not right. This disease can only be stopped because you stop the disease.
Mm-hmm.
It's good reasons to vaccinate so many different communities. And it was friends of mine, Bill Fagey and Helene Gale, who chaired that committee on equitable distribution. But I think it was too complicated. I don't think people could understand it. I think people were extremely frustrated. It advantaged people who had digital literacy. They could get on and game the system.
Appointment, yeah.
But these are short-term problems. We have much bigger problems.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I was just interested, and I'm glad that you explained that a little bit. I think part of this, again, it goes back to just, having kind of national leadership and national standards, so that you don't have one standard for Marin County, another for Contra Costa, another for Alameda, but everything is clear and well communicated and it's uniform. I think it helps a lot, and I think that's what we just keep learning again and again with this. But you probably remember one of our traditions that we take questions from the folks who are watching, and so we have a few questions tonight that are coming in. Considering teachers and with all the new and upcoming variants, should schools be opening at this time? Well, I know. What a great question.
So multiple crossroads?
Yes.
Here's another one. Kids do not get as good an education virtually as they do in person. Disadvantaged kids are doubly disadvantaged because of a lack of access to technology. We need to get our kids back to school. We know how to do it. We can test the kids and test the teachers, even without vaccinations, and make schools safe. But it's really expensive.
Yeah.
So I would look at this moment where we're all looking at the ski slope of the outbreak. It looks like it's coming down, but the truth is it's beginning to plateau.
Yeah.
Huge outbreak, speaking about schools at the Naval Academy right now. Maybe the outbreak is growing, doubling every 2 days. 25% of the midshipmen are infected.
Oh my goodness.
It's easier to open a school than it is to keep it open in an outbreak like this. And I don't think we're going to be bottoming out to zero. I think we're going to be plateauing, and I worry about the cadence of Easter Sunday, Memorial Day, 4th of July, and I don't want to see happen what just happened with Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's. So I'm really worried about opening schools unless in this stimulus package, there remains enough money to get the schools safe, to fix the ventilation system, to make sure the teachers are taken care of, and those teachers who are high risk get vaccinated, and those kids who are at high risk get cared for, and that we deal with that school with the same care that we're able to deal with the Democratic National Party convention or Hollywood or any of these things. And there is money in that stimulus package now for that. I hope it survives the cut.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great answer, and it's good to know too that it is a matter of money and will to. Here's the next question. The New Yorker has an article this week about the small percentage of deaths in many countries, poor countries, for example, India, compared to Western countries. The author had several possibilities, but no conclusion. Do you have any thoughts about this?
India is a paradox. The one thing that you're not hearing about India is they do a poor job of reporting COVID. So they underreport. But I think for Africa, which has an average age 15, 16, 17, compared to US, which are 35, 36, 37, the attack rate is so much higher. The attack rate of visible COVID, not asymptomatic COVID, is so much greater. The age structure of the population is one answer. I've heard all sorts of things like jasmine and turmeric and BCG vaccine. I don't think it's those things. I do think that poorer countries tend to be more outdoors countries. People in India live outdoors and come home to rest. It's not like we do. We stay at home, we go out to rest. I lived in India for 10 years. It is an outdoor environment. So I think if you add all those things together, outdoors, lower age of a lower average age, poor reporting, I think all those are part of it. They also have a government which has a little Trumpian kind of characteristics. And it isn't clear to me that the full communication is coming through. Africa is a bit more complicated. It's 40 some odd countries. Each one's different. There's a huge outbreak in South Africa that gave rise to the South African variant. And South Africa is probably the richest or one of the richest countries in Africa. We have a couple of states in Africa where they're not letting people wear masks, and a couple of states in Africa, countries in Africa, where the mask wearing is obligatory. So you can't think of it as one place. I wish I had a better answer, but the person.
I think those are great answers. They're very helpful for me too. That demographic difference is huge, and again, like you said, there's like these huge cultural differences, and it means that we fight COVID in a different way, slightly in different societies. Here's another question, which is a great question, so simple. Why do some people have worse side effects from the second shot and others don't? Do we know why?
No.
Yeah, great.
I mean, we know that people who have long COVID, long haul COVID, because they have those who the long haul COVID is due to an autoimmune phenomenon as opposed to a vasculitis. Those people tend to, if they had two vaccinations, tend to have had a more robust reaction. So it may be that the people who are having that robust reaction would have gotten the worst COVID. I don't know if that's true, but a lot of my colleagues seem to think that that's the fact. So that's another, maybe that's just a reason to pretend that all the trouble you went through in that second vaccine that gave you such a kick, it was really worth it. But at least some people believe that that's the fact.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Again, it's just there's so much that we still are learning about the disease. It's important to be reminded of that. Here's a question. I've heard that Ebola was controlled through vaccination circles, where you vaccinate outbreak areas at a higher rate. Should we do that in high-risk areas here? Like cities with high infection rates get more vaccinations first?
Well, that is actually what I'm working on all day today, the last 2 weeks. We called it ring vaccination, which is not a really good term, but that's how we eradicated smallpox. We found every case, we traced it backwards to where it came from. We found all the people who were infected by that original index case. And then we contact traced forward everybody who was part of the first case we found. And then we isolated them. We brought food to them so they didn't have to leave to go out and get food. and then we vaccinated them.
Yeah.
And so that combination is what allowed us to eradicate smallpox in the last 4 countries in the world. Ebola did something similar. They also did ring vaccination. They didn't have as good a vaccine. That Ebola vaccine had 55% efficacy, but it worked very well in concert with isolation. And it was an addition, not instead of vaccinating a lot of people and isolating them. I'm looking for ways that we can use that experience, that success story, those success stories, and find a way to put it to use. Stay tuned. There's a lot of people working on this.
Yeah, thank you. I thought about that too. What kinds of decades-long health impacts do you expect for the 28 million US COVID survivors? I'm thinking about the implications for the US healthcare system.
Yeah, I mean, for starters, every one of them now has a pre-existing condition.
Yeah.
The knock-on effects of this vasculitis, which will include, or has included in many people, strokes, has included in many people, pancreatitis and liver disease. We have people who got this disease the first weeks of the outbreak and still have it. We have other people who don't think they had it, but their immune status, their serum epidemiologist says they did have it. So the spectrum couldn't be greater from it was less than the flu to I died. I mean, it's really complex.
Yeah, it is. Within the faith community, there was quite a range in response to the government's public health mandates, especially as it related to public worship. What can we learn from COVID regarding religious freedom and public health protection efforts? That was a good question, though.
So Francis Collins, who's the head of the National Institute of Health, is a devout Christian. He writes extensively about living 2 lives. In fact, I interviewed him at the Commonwealth Club about 8 years ago on his faith and how he struggled with science and faith. And if you have a chance to listen to that, it's a radio show, it's on their website. He was phenomenal and reassuring that you don't have to give up one to serve the other. I think that we've all known since the country began that the separation of church and state is part of our DNA. It's the people who first came to this country, the Pilgrims, were fleeing religious persecution. We never wanted to institute an establishment of religion. The more we lean towards the establishment of religion, the more we're leaning backwards to those times in history that we fled such a place to come to the United States. I worry about an exemption for churches, unless that exemption is for every religion. And I worry also about just the sheer magnitude of large gatherings of people, whether that it's a barbecue or whether it's a religious activity. We know that the major super spreader event is lots of people indoors without masks, singing and cheering and talking and yelling and praising. So it does bother me. And when I studied the first outbreak in Seattle, the major super spreader event in Seattle was a choir.
Yeah,
and they were just singing praises. And you could even see that the people who were closest to the infected person sitting in the rows were the ones who got the worst disease. So let's just say this. Whether the place that you are has a crescent, a moon, or a Star of David, or a cross on it, the virus doesn't understand that.
Yeah, I've got to say, I think that public health directives should be based on what's safe and what's not safe, and whether it's a church or a movie theater or a shopping mall or a dentist's office. It just, you need to come up with the rules based on what makes the virus propagate, not based on what it is that people are doing in those places. Here's another question. They say there are more intellectual property patents held by immigrants, and that because of the immigrant experience of breaking schema, we are thinking outside the existing paradigm. Do you think it is because we have continuous immigration that has added to our ability to be innovative?
Well, of course. I mean, actually, a good place to look for that is in the real estate market. You'll see that a lot of big companies are abandoning the idea of having a headquarters where everybody has to come to work on the same day and have staff meetings, and that the only people they can then hire are within a 50-mile radius of that office. They say, why shouldn't I select the best people from anywhere in the world? Because with Zoom, they can participate. And we have been, Ronald Reagan's shining city on a hill. People have come here from countries in which it is very difficult to live day to day, let alone to start a company, have an idea, bring it to fruition. Sergey Brin, Steve Jobs. I mean, you can go on and on. So it is, to me, I think, maybe a affirmation that by opening our arms to the world, we get the best of the world. And as I said, the leaders of 3 of the top vaccine manufacturing companies are immigrants. It's not only immigrants that do a great job. We shouldn't forget that, but we shouldn't ignore their contributions either.
Yeah, I totally appreciate that. I think being in an open society where you do have those connections around the world, it just promotes just a lively intellectual environment also, and a richer culture too. Here's a question. I noticed a Buddha above you in the background. Please describe your spiritual practice.
Oh, maybe my wife would.
I know Gertrude could tell the truth.
I mean, we're certainly. When I was first asked this when we came back from India, because I say we lived in India for 10 years, and then I became a professor, and Girija got her PhD at the University of Michigan, and I was being interviewed once, and this was the Midwest. So they said, "What is your religion?" And they gave me a list, and I said, "I don't see mine. It should be the last one. It should say all of the above."
All of the above. Hey, that's why we love you, Larry. That's perfect.
That's the one I want.
Yeah.
Well, I've learned so much from Buddhism and Buddhist meditation. I've learned so much from Judaism. I've learned so much from Christianity and my love for Jesus and my love for the Gospels. I've learned so much from reading the Quran and understanding what charity means in Islam, and all the noble quests from monotheism and Zoroastrianism. There isn't a religion from which I haven't learned something and to which I'm not grateful. And I don't have room up above me of all the gods and goddesses and deities. I particularly like Buddha. I like the equanimity. I like the search for peace. I like the quietness of it. I like the community that's called the Sangha. I love the teachings, but I could be saying the same thing about Episcopalianism very easily.
Well, I think that's the reason why we're just such spiritual brothers, because I'm the same way. I've learned so much from Zen meditation practices, from stories from Hinduism, from all the religions that you've mentioned. What a blessing that we live in a time where we can communicate with each other, and we're not in some small, tiny village where we know nothing about what people are doing in the rest of the world. And what a gift it is to have you, such a gift to creation, someone so passionate about the search for truth, and someone so committed to helping people around the world to be healed and whole and happy. And I'm just so glad we run out of time. But it has been such a blessing to have you. I thank you so much for being here tonight.
Oh, Malcolm, and aren't we lucky to live in the city of St. Francis?
Oh, we are. We
are. Be able to welcome immigrants and welcome all of these religious traditions, and seek to learn from their places that's not true, even in our own country. And I'm very grateful to Grace Cathedral. It has been the host of many events that are the most important in my life, and I love the community. Thank you for inviting me back. And Girija, who's hiding behind that screen that says Larry Brilliant, that is not Larry Brilliant, that is Girija Brilliant. And she's there, and she would join me in saying how much we love all of you.
Yeah, and that's, again, we love you so much, Girija. The two of you are such an extraordinary partnership, and we're just blessed by you. Thank you very much. For all of the rest of you, please join me next week when my guest will be Judith Butler, author of the groundbreaking Gender Trouble, and she'll be talking about her latest book, The Force of Nonviolence. You can help us bring the arts to life at Grace Cathedral with a gift today to the forum. Please text Grace to 76278, or visit gracecathedral.org/give to grace. And Larry, it's so good to see you. I never know when it is that we'll be brought back into each other's orbit, but each time is such a pleasure. God bless you both. And I hope you are well. And I look forward to when I can see you both in person.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And God bless you.
Yep. Good night, everybody.
Good night.